Hello and welcome to the latest podcast from Utility Week. I'm the editor, James Wallin, and this time we have a very special treat in store for you. Very proud to be partnering with a group of the finest minds in energy policy for a new initiative called the Energy Geeks. Readers of Utility Week will be very familiar with this cast of experts who've come together in an attempt to have the conversations no one else is having and to tackle the problems that are put in the too difficult box by others. The first report from this group is already out. It's called Delivering Customer Cost, Carbon and Connections Dividends, and you can find that on the Utility Week website. It aims to highlight where there are immediate and systemic efficiencies that can be realised on the energy system. And this is to ensure that with all of the changes that are going to be needed to totally decarbonise the energy system, we need to do this as quickly and effectively as possible. Now, these changes range from flexible connections to a new approach to smart metering, an overhaul of voltage level standards. Put together, the recommendations in this report are estimated to equate to around 10% of energy savings on the path to clean power by 2030. Now, in assembling our Avengers of Waste on the energy system, I suppose I am shamelessly casting myself in the Nick Fury role. And as such, I will only really pop up in the end credits of this production. Instead, I'm going to bring you a recording of a session from Utility Week Forum, which took place in London back in November, featuring all of our energy geeks, who are Eric Brown, Maxine Frerk, Roger Hay, Laura Sandys, Stephen Steer, and Alan Whitehead. They're each going to tackle a particular section of the report, and then we're going to hear the answers to just one of the many questions thrown at our experts from the audience. Each of them is going to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their background before delving into their chosen topic, and we're going to be kicking off with Laura Sandys.
We're all come from different parts of the energy sector, but absolutely passionate about us accelerating the decarbonisation journey and ensuring that we are doing it in the most efficient and most effective way. And as James says, the more efficiently that we can deliver this energy transition, the cheaper it will be, but actually the faster it will be. So as we develop this program, by the way, we're called the Energy Geeks, right? Because actually the things that we're excited about, we're excited about lots of things, but we're particularly excited about those elements that actually other people find boring. We're interested in the plumbing, in the system design, in trying to find those incremental changes, small changes that absolutely build the best team, the best system. So that is what we have done in this report. It actually was delivered and developed for the shadow energy team before the election. And we do hope that some of these issues will be taken up. We are also very, very conscious, and while some of these, in many ways, efficiency gains, and we think there's probably at least about 10% efficiency gains across all our recommendations, but just think we are going to double at least our electricity consumption. So if we don't bear down on these inefficiencies and these pockets of waste now, we will be in trouble as we go forward. Each of us is going to cover the areas that we're particularly focused on with particular experience. And I will just open up with a couple of my bugbears that I feel is absolutely crucial for us to address. But as you can see, we're looking at whole system management, operational efficiencies, and waste reduction as our themes. So the first thing that I'd like to cover is whole system costings. Everyone has got a model for this. Some people use levelized cost of electricity. But actually what we need as a transformational process is to have a common set of languages that is absolutely identifying whole system costs, a model that we can all use. NESO uses a different model from Ofgem. Then certain trade associations use different models. We have got to have a common sense of truth that actually drives the efficiencies that we need across the system. The second issue is one of our recommendations is that every £10 spent on supply options, so whether that be CFDs, whether it be cap and floor, that we need £1 spent on energy efficiency. I think that we need almost like a transitional fiscal rule by which we're spending a percentage on energy efficiency, and that is at the demand side. And if you think that every pound spent on supply, you have to add 26p for networks, you've got 2 or 3p for balancing, you've got more money for policy costs, and also 12p on that pound for suppliers. So it's actually, every pound spent on supply costs £1.57. Every pound spent on energy efficiency actually reduces all of that, and you don't need to deliver that unit of supply. So we think that it's a really important rule that actually we need to really focus on. And the last issue that I'm going to cover before I hand over to this illustrious group of fabulous people is about roles and responsibilities. There is so much overlap and underlap. Do we know where NESO's roles and responsibilities start and stop? Do we know where DSOs sit within the system, and how do they interrelate with DNOs? When we start to look at aggregators, then we start to look at mission control, DESNES, Ofgem, and then all the other sort of code bodies, etc. We have got a multitude of organizations, of people duplicating work. The lack of clarity is costing a huge amount of money, because actually what you're getting is a lot of people duplicating the work and not knowing where their boundaries are. This I believe, will accelerate our transition quite significantly, clarify what people are meant to do, and in many ways reduce cost. But I don't think that we can leave it any longer, because the more complex the system, the more these overlaps and underlaps start to become a major problem. So those are my 3 key asks. I think that the team here have actually got much more specific and textured asks. And what we're trying to do is to open up a debate.
My name's Steer. In my day job, I build and design and advise on digital and data platforms. Relevant in the past, I used to work at Ofgem. I set a lot of the data and digital regulations for the sector. So you may know those as things such as the presumed open data that's expected of energy network companies, and the expectation that they will put forward digitalization strategies and that they have action plans with them as well. So these are themes that I've worked on over the years. That all stems from what's now actually quite a long while ago. So back when we had the Energy Data Task Force, which concluded its report in 2019. So we're already 5 years out from that. Over those years, on the one hand, I'm very conflicted. On the one hand, it's really wonderful and lovely just how much progress the sector has made. It is now business as usual that our energy networks have open data portals available for anyone to come and ask for literally any data they want and have a constructive conversation around it, and in most cases, get the data that they are looking for, which is excellent progress over just a few years. And that's not the only thing, but that's just one example of it. But on the other hand, I still see us in our infancy when it comes to digitalization, that what is now heavily overused phrase or word. I think a lot of people find it instinctive to start thinking about the energy system itself when we start talking about digitalization, and that's fine and right, but it's only one part of the puzzle. What I did today, so we've had a lot of really lovely talks, and I just took a few notes as I was going, as we stepped through those talks, and was recognizing all the different ways that data and sometimes digital systems are needed to allow us to not just get the energy system working, but to get the entire energy service design working, so that the whole thing, commercials and governance and process and practice all together, make sense and therefore give us an efficient and well-run service rather than just the system. So we had the chair of Ofgem talk to us and highlight how he found it was a TARDIS when he turned up to Ofgem, and it was a really big information challenge just for him to understand what his own organisation's body of work was to do to look after the sector. We had CGI talk to us about digital twins in Wales and how there were 5 different network companies there discovering how much pain they cause one another because they hadn't had the information and the awareness previously to know how each of their roles is affecting people, not just in their own organisation, but in the organisations around them. I could go on, I've got a list of 10 here, but I think it will probably take too long. My point is that there are a lot of challenges that are not just about how do we design the system differently, but it's really just an information challenge, and digitalisation is a very broad and diffuse term. It doesn't have hard edges. So whilst we do have the emergence of strategies and good intentions in a lot of the sector's efforts and investment plans, they tend to be very inward focused on the job that organisation is doing to digitalise its own services. Which is good, but it's not going to service and solve the whole problem, the integrated challenge of an overall energy service that goes across different organisations, down to the individuals and the consumers who don't really care about the individual organisations in the sector. So digitalisation is making progress, but actually one of the really key features that we're missing, and I'll just keep it simple for this short talk, is that we're not investing in making it practical to understand what everybody is doing around us. I mean, I've seen 10 different projects in one morning at one conference that the energy sector is getting on with. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are not at the conference today who are all getting on with building other services that involve the use of data, whether it's analog or digital, whether it's spoken and verbal, or whether it's written down into machines and computers. And there is no reasonable way, there is no deliverable, practical way that we can know and control and govern what is happening to the energy service as a whole. So one of our points that we're making is that we need to make the energy sector governable, and digitalisation has a strong role to play in that. And so we need to digitalise the governance itself to cut through the complexity of the sector. Otherwise, you have no reasonable way of knowing where you're duplicating work and where you're overlapping and affecting people. We need a model and understanding for how energy services take place in the round beyond our own organisations. So there's a lot of work to be done in improving the quality of our strategies as a sector for what it means to digitalise.
I'm Eric Brown. I'm an independent consultant in energy systems, and I'm formerly the CTO from Energy Systems Catapult. In my work, I spend time trying to think horizontally about the whole energy system, how the various parts and actors interwork with each other to deliver outcomes for the economy, for society, and for people and communities that depend on energy services. So although my work is typically looking horizontally, today I'm going to explore a couple of the verticals, 2 aspects which I think are important underpinnings for achieving whole system outcomes. And the first of those is standards. Now, standards is a word that sometimes makes us feel kind of warm and friendly because it means we're exchanging data or working well together, and it's standardized can be quite a nice word. It can also strike fear into the hearts of people who actually develop standards because it usually means sitting in rooms having unpleasant conversations with unpleasant people with political motivations or commercial motivations of one kind or another, and having done that, I was one of them. But standards have a very important role to play, and if we look at the energy system today, they are deeply embedded. Some of those are the laws of physics, and Laura and I talk about the laws of physics. She calls me the physics police every once in a while, but the laws of physics matter. More importantly, though, when we privatized the energy sector, we embedded quite a lot of new standards, codes, and so on, practices, well-established practices, standards, codes, as I mentioned, which relate to how we plan, operate, and build networks. And those are important, and they have resulted in the system that we have today, which is highly reliable, highly resilient, delivers good service, and so on. But if we're going to deliver the most value from transformation of the energy system, we have to acknowledge the fact we have to transform the standards as well, because they're going to enable us to deliver the right kind of outcomes or the right kind of ambition from the system. This can mean either changing the existing standards, or it can mean creating new ones. All of this relies on us having some understanding of the new architecture of the system, which is radically changing as it goes from being centralized to distributed, for example, the increasing role of digitalization in the system. We need to think about new types of services that we're trying to deliver, new types of business models, and we need to think about the very much more dynamic nature of the energy system as a whole. We need to spend some time thinking about standards and investing effort in them. The surprising thing is we've actually already done a lot of that. And I'm going to refer to a particular piece of work. It was a very substantial piece of work called the Engineering Standards Review, which was completed back, I believe, in 2020, which is now December of 2020, so it's about 4 years ago. And it was a very substantial piece of work. It was done by a committee of experts supported by Fraser Nash. It was commissioned by Bayes and Ofgem. And it's a really good piece of work, and it's produced some really good recommendations. And I can tell you what's happened with it: absolutely nothing. And this is hugely disappointing, because there is a great consolidation of things that we really do need to think about hard in that particular piece of work. It organizes itself to focus, first of all, on some really quite techy engineering matters, and this is relating to how you calculate value of lost load, these types of questions which are really important when it comes to network design, for example. And then it looks more generally at the question of net zero and so on. Quite importantly, it also comes to the point that standards are not some boring document you put on the shelf and use to force compliance out of some people. They are, as I said before, dynamic, and therefore you need to think about how you govern them and how you ensure that they remain current and valuable to those who are going to be using them. Coming back to the point of trying to quantify, well, what difference does it make? The study comes to the conclusion that you could realize something on the order of 5 to 10 billion pounds worth of value in the long term, and then there's annual benefits as well, again measured in big numbers. Now the caveat on that, of course, is that you need to understand the interactions between them, because the recommendations are not independent, so you can't multiply the benefits up, if you like, and you also need to understand that there's dependencies on markets and regulation and policy and so on being put in place to enable the changes to be made, and hence for the benefits to be achieved. But nonetheless, it's sufficiently substantial that it seems quite incredible that with that kind of potential even to get benefit for doing things you're going to have to do somehow, why wouldn't you take the benefit of having a consolidated view of the types of changes you have to make in pursuit of a useful change? Of course, that study is not the only one. I'll just make a couple of other references to standards, which are also, I think, hugely useful. One is from the Electricity Networks Commissioner project, which some of you are familiar with, about accelerating a transmission build. I was involved in that project. And in there, it does come to the question of both design principles and design standards. And this is, I highlight this because it points to another use of standards, which is not just technical. In that case, it comes to the question of supply chain. If we were more careful in how we standardize the way we build things, it can give opportunities for supply chains to respond in a much more consistent and consolidated way. And one quote I heard in the course of doing that work: every time the UK goes to an OEM, they rock it up and ask for an R&D project as opposed to buying a product. And I think that's because we think we're special, everything we want to do, and so we ask for something basically bespoke. Another place, and then I'll stop going on about standards, but the last example I want to use is because it's the one that there's been fleeting references to standards in the course of the last couple of days. Usually it means we want to get interoperability between devices in homes, and that is one perspective on it. I guess what I would caution, though, is interoperability doesn't necessarily mean standardization, because interoperability could be bilateral. And I think you have to, this comes back to the point, you need to look at the problem you're trying to solve. You need to understand the system you're trying to build, and then find where the standards are actually going to be useful as opposed to an impediment. And I think that's coming again back to the engineering standards. I think they thought that kind of thing through, so that the recommendations tend to point to places of value.
Fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roger Hay. I'm the engineer in the pack. I've spent over 35 years of my career working in and around the electricity networks space. In common with many of my colleagues here, I'm now working as an independent. So I'm free to say anything I like, which has never really stopped me before, to be honest, anyway. So I'm going to go even deeper into one of the standards and one of the verticals. I'm going to talk to you about voltage. So voltage nominally that comes into your home, you know, we all know it's 230 volts in the UK. It has been that since 1995 is when we standardised on 230 volt. Previous to that, we were standardised on 240 volts in the UK. And I've got a long-standing interest in trying to understand the relationship between voltage, energy consumption, energy losses, and the amount of low-carbon technologies, generation or demand, electric vehicles, heat pumps, that we can get onto the low-voltage system. There's also a growing issue, not major yet, around high volts on the system. So if the voltage is too high, appliances can cut out. So there is largely anecdotal evidence at the moment, but increasingly being backed up by quantitative data that solar panels, solar inverters are dropping out in the summer, in the middle of the day, because the volts are going too high. And we're starting to see instances where electric vehicle chargers are not coming on at night because the voltage is too high. Now, it's not a big issue. It's not well evidenced, but I don't think a lot of customers will really understand. So if your car doesn't charge, is the first thing you think, oh, I wonder what the voltage was last night? No. It's, did I program the app wrong again last night, or did I remember to plug it in? And there's a million other reasons. So I think that's going to come. To my knowledge, and again, with all the proposals that we've made, we're willing to be shot down, but I can't find any evidence that voltage has been properly reviewed for over 30 years. We've got a completely changed system. So all the assumptions we had over how the low voltage networks worked are no longer true. We've got two-way power flows, completely different profile already, and then it's going to change even more again into the future. 30 years ago, we also assumed that there was no such thing as digitalization. So everything had to be passive and deterministic. So the UK voltage range, I say 230 volt nominal. It actually varies. The electricity network companies, DNOs, have to keep it between 216 volts and 253. So it's that 253 that's being breached some of the time in summer for solar and for electric vehicles at night. The UK average, you would expect to be sat somewhere near 230, wouldn't you? No, 243.2 volts based on the data that we've looked at. So it's some distance above. In terms of appliance standards, appliances are standardised across the EU. They can actually work anywhere between 207 volts, so lower than the UK standard, up to 253. So what's the big deal? I'm getting more volts for free. That's got to be a good thing, right? Yeah? But it's not, because the higher the voltage, actually the higher your bills are as well. So in our report, you will see that we are suggesting that for every 1% of voltage reduction, so a couple of volts, you get about 1.2% reduction in energy consumption and energy bills. There is some debate over why that's the case, and some of the scientists and physicists will point you to the formulas and the equations and the theoretics, but there's a massive body of innovation projects and observed data that show that for every 1% reduction, you do actually get 1.2%. So we can't just stand around and disagree on it. We need to work out, as a minimum, why there is a difference. Most of the DNOs have explored this relationship. Many of them have got multi-award winning projects in this space, but none of them have actually rolled anything out at scale as yet. So again, we are questioning why that is the case. So our assertion is that the static designs we've been using for 30 years cannot any longer be considered economic and efficient. First duty of the network companies. We believe that digital can be used to drive a far better optimum of what the voltage ought to be in different locations. And our starting point is we think we could drop the UK voltage, that average of 243, down by 4%. That would bring the average down to about 233. And that would save about £770 million a year on customer bills. It would also save about 1.4 million tonnes of carbon. So these are not small savings. And that's without taking into account the money that NESO spends on voltage services and potentially other savings around losses and the like as well.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Alan Whitehead. I have been until relatively recently the then opposition's shadow energy minister, although what I was more often known at was the shadow minister for details and difficult things, which is the particular area of the energy firmament that I always have been particularly interested in. That is, as Laura has mentioned, what is it about the plumbing of the system, the basics of the system, that actually enables all the shiny things that we talk about in terms of renewable and low carbon energy actually to work and get going. And if those essential elements aren't there, then nothing else works. So we can actually produce as much offshore wind as we want over the next few years. But as we are already recognizing, if you can't land it, move it about, remove the constraints from it, deliver it to people's homes in a way that they can use, then a lot of the effort that goes into that is substantially wasted. So I'm not shadow energy minister anymore. I'm not the energy minister now, otherwise I'd be talking in an entirely different conference. But I'm, because I didn't stand for Parliament the last time round, I'm now in a position to say what I like about the energy system. And indeed, this is one reason why I have been delighted to join this august group of people, because they are absolutely on my wavelength as far as what needs to be done as far as the energy system is concerned. And you see from the report that a number of very important basics, I think, about the plumbing of the system have been identified, and hopefully will lead to some action in the not too distant future. And one aspect of that I want to say a few words about today has been something that stuck with me throughout my period as Shadow Minister, and that is the development and rollout of smart meters. Now, we've heard a lot about the effective disaster that smart meters have turned out to be. But when we reflect on what smart meters are about, they're not about gas and lecky, they're not about the dial that shows you how much energy you've used over the last day. Quite important that you do know that. They are essentially about securing a data point in everybody's household in order to make the digital energy revolution work. That's how basic and important they are to the whole system. And the fact of the matter is that as far as data points in people's houses are concerned, we have failed miserably to get anywhere near that basic level of information and data exchange and management and control of the system that will be necessary to make the digital and low carbon system work properly. We have the phrase rollout, I think is better stagger out. We have staggered out with something about 58% in theory of smart meters installed in people's homes. Now, bearing in mind in 2012, and I sat through all the various bits of legislation that went with smart meters and the extensions of various things, we were supposed to have getting on for 100% by 2019. And we've had repeated extensions over the period after 2019. We're still way off that 70%, which is the sort of latest target of smart meters in people's homes that would actually make the system as a whole reasonably conceivably work. So, I mean, not only have we not got near that, we've got a couple of disasters coming around the bend, which makes it even worse. That is, number one, 3 to 4 million of those smart meters that have been installed, for various reasons, don't work. That takes your total of usable smart meters down to about 52% of the population. And secondly, the system upon which, certainly in the south of England, or the majority of those people who've had their smart meters installed, the 2G and 3G systems are being phased out in the not too distant future. The government has agreed that those systems will be phased out not later than 2033. But of course, they are in the hands of individual operators, and most of those operators are phasing their the 2G and 3G systems out for perfectly good economic reasons well before 2033, in some instances this year, next year. What that means is that fairly shortly, 11 million smart meters will not be operable because they are not transferable to 4G and 5G. SMETS 2s are, by the way, you need a patch for them, but they will simply have to be taken out of people's homes and other things put in. This is nuts and really needs to be fundamentally fixed at a very early stage. And what we are saying in the report, among other things, is consideration of whether you translate a lot of that fixing and the further progress of smart meters away from the retail companies, put them in the hands of DNOs, and have basically an area by area rollout of those changes and those fixes. A lot of other proposals we also put forward, which is along the lines of how do we fix this question of the idea that smart meters were supposed to be a voluntary activity. What we found in other countries where they actually say, well, new meters are coming in, old meters are going out, but by and large the public just puts the new meters in. The slogan of getting on and doing things is perhaps pretty important in this context. So should we move to mandation of removal of old meters and putting new meters in? Do we actually move in this country to actually equipping ourselves with a system which actually works to make everything else work, or do we continue to muddle along to get smart meters working properly across the country?
I'm Maxine Frerk. For those who don't know me, I spent 15 years at Ofgem, And like others, I'm now independent, so I wear a number of different hats. But basically, I'm an energy geek, I'm a regulatory wonk, and I care about there being a just transition and us hitting the targets that we need to hit. So when Laura mentioned to me, was I interested in joining this group to think about waste, my mind immediately went to one of my particular hobby horses, which is losses. So you may not be aware, but of the electricity that we feed into the system through what's generated, about 10% of that is lost before it reaches your house. A small amount of that is theft, but the majority are technical losses because the wires heat up and the bits of equipment heat up as the electricity goes through them. So roughly 10% more on the distribution networks and a bit, but still a significant amount on transmission. And because the engineers will explain properly, the losses increase with the square of the current that is flowing through, i.e. effectively the more demand there is, significantly higher losses. At peak time, it's probably double that. So 20% of the capacity that we've got to build to hit 2030, if we keep losses at the same level, is just going to dissipate in heat. So for me, this is a really serious issue. It affects both customers' bills today, but also affects our ability to hit 2030. And in particular, if there's a sense that we're going to be working the network even harder than we are today. One level I've been told, it's physics, dear, and we can't do anything about it, but that's not the case. And in fact, many of the networks have got various things that they've been looking at over the years to try to tackle losses. There's low loss equipment, different types of metal would, emit more or less heat. You can do things about balancing the loads across the network. If you've got one that's highly loaded and one that's less highly loaded, if you get the two strands sort of more evenly balanced, that will reduce your losses. You can play around with voltage in the way that Roger talked about. And you can have just bigger cables will again help you reduce losses. So there's lots of other things that you can do. So there's a real need, and there are things that the networks can do to reduce losses. Networks tend to do what the regulator drives them to do. And for a long period, there used to be a financial incentive on the networks to reduce losses. That was dropped in ED2 after I left Ofgem. So I get a hobby horse about these things. And they moved to having just a reputational incentive. Companies would put out a report once a year saying what they'd done. Companies are very driven by financial incentives, and they do tend to respond very well and will come out with very innovative ways of making sure that they can make more money for their shareholders. So my real concern is that we have moved away at a time when we needed it more than ever from having a proper financial incentive on losses. Now, I've been banging the drum about this really ever since ED2, the ink was dry. And I'm pleased to say that in their framework decision for ED3, Ofgem actually have 47 mentions of the word losses. So they've kind of woken up to the fact that this is important, but we're still a long way from having any concrete proposals about how they might evolve the regulatory framework to take account of it. So our report is very much saying the companies need to be doing more. Ofgem needs to really make sure that it's got a proper financial incentive and driving them to do more. And in fact, in other European countries, the networks are actually responsible entirely for the losses. So they pay for the whole cost of losses. And in some sense, that's equivalent to a strong financial incentive. And government needs to be, if Ofgem aren't kind of pulling their socks up, then government needs to be giving them a strong steer in that direction. So that's electrical losses, and they are really significant. On the gas side, the volumes are much lower in terms of the kind of extent of leakage of methane from the networks, and a lot has been done over the last 20 years as the companies have been replacing iron mains pipes with the plastic pipes. That reduces leakage. But the problem there is that methane is, over a 20-year life, 83 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Actually, it's quite important for trying to avoid short-term tipping points. So it does matter from a climate point of view. It has a bit of a bill impact, but not that much. It's like 0.3% of gas is leaked, or at least that's what we think. The problem is that in terms of methane leakage on the gas networks, it's actually an assumed number that comes out of a model that was based on some tests that were done in about 1970. And it only models certain things like the amount of iron mains pipe. Other bits of kit, your above ground installations, for example, emissions are assumed to be fixed. It's really a model for allocating the cost of the leakage between different suppliers. It's a pretty lousy way of actually understanding and tracking the amount of methane that is leaking from the gas networks and whether or not the companies are doing anything about it. Sometimes they can do things that are quite innovative. One of the gas networks that I do some work with has got stent bags that if there's a leak, it kind of captures the methane in like a giant balloon and can feed it back in. It gets no credit for that either with Ofgem or even in its greenhouse gas reporting, because the official way of measuring methane leakage is through this sort of very outdated model. So the message there is really one about, as we've said, if you've got better data, then you can start to accurately understand what you need to do.
Those were the opening thoughts of the Energy Geeks, and we then moved on to questions from the audience, where we got a lot of really interesting points thrown up. We've concentrated here on just one question, which was answered by a number of members of the panel, and that was around that hottest of topics, the smart meter rollout. As you heard before, Alan is keen to see the process overhauled, but surely handing the rollout over to energy networks and away from retailers would just add even more complexity and more delay.
Well, in many ways, it wouldn't take that long because smart meters, for example, are all installed on a third-party basis. So that's the further problem for the system, in as much as those people who are actually putting the smart meters in don't care whether they work or not, for example. They just have to put them in according to a certain target. However, the retail companies, who are basically the commissioners of those people putting them in, also have no control over how those go in, because they're at arm's length. So you could detach the retail companies from putting the smart meters in without having any effect on the actual process of putting those in. What the difference would be instead of having a dozen companies potentially walking up your street on the same day and pulling the SMETS ones out and putting the SMETS 2 in, putting interoperable meters in, or indeed installing them, you just have one body planning this, the same people who own the meters effectively, putting them in, but under much better supervision and control and overall planning.
And cost reduction.
Enormous cost reduction. So it wouldn't actually be difficult to do.
Yeah, it couldn't possibly be any worse, to be perfectly honest. So there is an opportunity of change around the sort of responsibility for the metering rollout. As Alan said, we've got to about 50%. We might get a little bit higher, but then it's likely to slide back again. There's currently no guarantees of service around the thing working. So if you're on a time of use tariff and your meter fails, tough. You'll just be paying a standard flat rate, which again you can sort of see if you moved it into the network space. Ofgem are very good at sort of guarantees of service and time to fix and stuff. So there could be some customer benefits. As Laura was just saying, the opportunities around efficiency are not just systems, but we can look again at the spec. I mean, the meter's completely over-spec'd. It does a whole bunch of things that nobody uses. We also do smart gas meters. Anyone here on a smart gas tariff? It just isn't a thing. So we need to fundamentally look again, stick to the basics, get a meter that can deliver the amounts of flexibility that Clean Power 2030 says we need.
Yeah.
We don't always agree on absolutely every detail of everything. I'm probably slightly less convinced about moving it across to the networks, but we absolutely need to have a kind of a real drains up and, something that takes an area-based approach. They have done some pilot in Derby with the suppliers working together so that you can get the benefits of doing something on a coordinated area basis. And I think they're looking at something in London. So even if you don't go the whole hog, and, to some extent, this is because we sit around and we have a chat and we brainstorm ideas. We haven't done a massive, great study on the costs and benefits of the different approaches. We're going with our guts, but I think there could be a role for networks. I'm slightly less convinced, but we've absolutely got to do something because we ain't going to get there if we just carry on doing the same thing that we'll be doing.
And one easy thing is that you take the gas, smart gas meter away from the contract. I'm in a flat, I can't get I can get a smart electricity meter, but I can't get a smart gas one. So you've got a lot of
those
households.
would be thrown out. If people are gradually moving off gas anyway, we're installing these assets that are extremely, they're the most expensive bit of the kit.
Yeah.
So I'm going to risk defending the smart meter program. I'm just kidding. I'm not really going to defend it.
Oh, what a relief. I was really worried.
But I think there's an interesting point here, right? Because we've talked in the course of the last day or so about if we're going to achieve a 2030 and so on, we're going to have to do that with a great sense of pace and a high level of uncertainty, and we will have to do stuff. We have to make decisions and do stuff. And I think this smart meter program illustrates the point where you do, but you don't monitor, measure, and then learn, and then adapt. So now we're in a situation where, as Alan describes it, we're in a cul-de-sac. So I guess what you wouldn't want the smart meter program to do is discourage decision-making and innovation for fear of making a mistake. I think what you have to do is act, and then explicitly learn from what you're doing in real time and do things like minimum viable products, minimum viable systems, whatever you want to call them. Yeah. Actively deploy, actively learn, and actively adapt. It's not really defense of the smart meter program. You could defend them for having done something, but you couldn't defend them for not having learnt and responded. I think it might be a way I'd put it.
Okay, but can I add one other thing, and that is that NESO is saying that they want 5 times more domestic flexibility by 2030, right? How are they going to do that without proper deployment of smart meters?
See, I read the report that came out of NESO, and I think it was a mastery of the English language, right? I think they said to get to CP 2030, you would need to have this much flexibility if these conditions were in place. And they haven't actually said.
But they've got the chart that shows a massive amount.
I know, and they also said they're going to lower bills if, right? So you have to read the report. It's really well written like that. It identifies the dependency. I mean, it's a work of art. It identifies the dependencies and then distributes them. And so they do.
I did read it absolutely on a train from front to back, but I do like pictures, and so I saw this big thing, and I thought
they use the word 32 times. I counted them.
That brings us to the end of our latest podcast, which I hope you enjoyed. You can read the full report from the Energy Geeks. There'll be a link in the notes to this podcast, and you can also find it on the Utility Week website, where you can also find some blogs from the group. And the latest piece of content we have up on there is a checklist for what needs to be achieved in 2025 if we have any hope of hitting the 2030 clean power target. So please do head over and have a look at that. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and hope to catch you on one of these podcasts again soon. you.